In this episode, we're going to look at creating a HTTP client using Pact consumer testing. Hi, I'm Mark Bradley, and welcome to Testing All the Things, a screencast in which we use live coding to demonstrate different types of testing tools and techniques. In this video, we are going to create a HTTP client for our book API. We are going to use Pact consumer testing to ensure that our client works as expected. Let's look at the code. In this video, we're going to create a HTTP client that will make calls to the book API we created in the last few episodes. And we're going to use Pact to test that our HTTP client can consume the API how we expect. Pact is an API contract testing framework. So this video will be in two parts. Today we're going to create the consumer contract, and in the next video we will ensure the contract is met by running it against the producer. Let's make a start on the code. Firstly, we'll create a test file. We'll call it book client test. And while we're here, we'll also create the implementation file. So book client. Move the implementation over to the right hand side. Book test, and we'll put the implementation into book. We're going to use Testify to run our tests, and we're going to use Pact as our contract testing framework. We'll start with our first test. We'll start by testing the 404 not found case for our book. We'll create a test. We need to create the suite first, sorry. Testify suite. We'll call it book client. And now we'll create a test for the suite. Get book that does not exist. The first thing we need to do is create an instance of Pact for us to work with. So Pact pause Pact, like so. And we need to set up a few settings. First one, we need to name our consumer that we're working on. So consumer. So this is the, let's call it Mark's book client. And we also need to name the provider that we are going to expect him to talk to. So provider. And the provider is called the book API. There we go. And we're just going to define where we want our Pact file to be saved at the end of this. So Pact, and we're just going to stick it into Pact, like so. Okay. So that's Pact set up. So we've defined the consumer. This is what we're working on at the moment, and we've named it Mark's book client. And we've also named the provider that we expect to implement this contract, and that's the book API. At this point, we need to add an expected interaction to Pact. So Pact dot and add interaction. So we can hook into our provider at this point using a given statement. It allows us to tell the provider that it needs to do some setup. And then when the provider starts running these tests, it can hook into the givens and react to them and do the setup it needs. So we are going to say given, and we want to say there is not a book with ISBN. Like that. So this we're going to give our provider the opportunity to make sure there's no book available with this ISBN, and it can delete it if it's there. Okay, so now we can move on to the next step. So we can now use upon receiving to give a nice description of what is going to happen in this test. So a get request for book with ISBN. Let's make this screen a bit bigger so we can kind of see everything for now. So now we can define the request that the provider should expect to be given. With request, we can give it a request, so dsl.request, and again we can start to fill in some of the fields. We know it's a get, so we can tell it the method will be get. Method get. We know the path, so we can define the path. So that is book / an ISBN. That needs to be not just a plain string, it needs to be a DSL string. And we're also going to say it's going to expect a header as well. So headers matcher. Now we expect to send an accept header. Say what format we want our response in. String, and that would be application/JSON. So there is our request set up. This is part of the contract saying this is the request I will give. The next step is to define how we expect the provider to respond. We'll respond with, and this function takes a dsl.response. So at this point, we are defining the response part of the contract. Given the request we've talked about, how should our provider respond? We know this is the not found case, so we'll look at the status first. So status, and we want to use HTTP status not found. There we are. We also can check headers again. So we've sent the accept header. We can say that we expect back headers to be. So we need the content type back. So content type. And we can also define what the body should look like. So body. Now we could at this point use the match functionality to define and hard code some JSON to this body. That's one way of doing it. But what we're going to do today is we're going to actually use a matcher of the struct. So if we do dsl.match, now we need to create our struct. What I'm going to do to cheat and do this very quickly is I'm just going to copy and paste the error struct from our producer code. And I'm going to stick this in the implementation side. We have our error JSON. So we can just do book dot, it's not public. It's public for this one. JSON error. Comma there. And that's the setup of our contract done. We now need to tell Pact to verify the request. s dot no error, pact dot verify, and we need to provide a function to the verify that returns an error, which we haven't created yet. And this is our test function. This is a function that will run the client code, validate the response, and return an error if anything goes wrong. So we're going to call our function test, and we can create it here. So test equals function returns an error. First thing we need our test function to do is have access to our client. Create a variable called C, and that's book.new client. And the client will need a URL to talk to. And this is where Pact becomes incredibly helpful, because as part of our setup here, Pact provides us with a server to talk to, and it records the interaction. And if the interaction is not as expected, the verify function will error out. If we use the wrong URL or we forget to send an accept header, we'll get an error back there. And then it's our responsibility to check the response is correct, and we use it and put it into the struct correctly. So what we're going to do is fmtp dot sprintf. Now, our Pact server is running on localhost. But we need to know what port it's running on. So %d, and that's Pact. That has access to the server that it's running and the port, like so. So now our client will talk to the Pact server that we have configured here. Next thing to do is call our function book, and it will have an error returned as well in case anything goes wrong. That's c dot get book, and we need to provide the ISBN, which is that. We know actually at this point we're not going to get a book because we're expecting an error, so we'll ignore that. We're only expecting the error back, so we need to make an assertion on the error. What we can do is say if error dot error it doesn't know it's an error yet. It's not equal. Now let's use the code. So the code will be 1, 2, 3, 4, and no book with ISBN, like so. Now we're expecting to build that error message based on the response we get in the error code. We can do return error, new error, say what happened, error response returned not as expected. That. So that's our typo there, our setup of our test done. But how are we going to know that our message code, our error code will be 1, 2, 3, 4, and our error message will be no book with ISBN, like so? Well, this is where we can add Pact into this, and we can say example for our will equal 1, 2, 3, 4, and Miss the colon. Go. And we can provide an example also. An example for our message. Which is this. There we go. So with the matching here, we've now provided the exact example they're expecting back, so we can use it in our testing. Now our test is all set up, let's start with the implementation. Before I run the tests, I can see I've got these reds, so I'm going to let the IDE highlighting show me that I need to fix those and create these functions. First one will be the new book function. New client function. Takes a host, which is a string, and it's going to return a client. We need a client, so we'll quickly create that. We can return it. Come here for no reason. So that's this line of the test working. The next line of the test to get working and to do is this get book function on the client. Call it get book. Takes a ISBN, which is a string, and it returns a book and an error. There we go. Right, let's change that to C now. Okay, so we need to grab a book. Again, I'm going to quickly nab the book from our existing code. Stick this up here. So we can now return the book and no error. Test now has no reds, so let's run the test and see what happens. We've got a missing return at the end of the function. Okay, so we need to return nil here if it all goes well. Let's try again. You can see here Pact is configuring its Pact server before it runs the test. So we've now got an error in our test. So we have an invalid pointer. Let's see if we can find where that is. So it's 54. So the error is not an error. So we need to make an error be returned. So let's do that first of all. So errors new. Don't know what it needs to be, so it just needs to be blah for now. Test. So now we've got something more legible. So received unexpected error. That's fair enough. So we can solve that. We can just do a quick copy paste job. And that should solve it. We solved the error because we just hard-coded the response. So this stopped erroring. But now we're into the Pact contract verification. So it's saying we've not made the request to get the book by its ISBN. So we need to now start talking to a HTTP server. We know we're going to need the host. So we'll do that. So that's going to need to be accessed from the client, and we also need to pass the host in here. So we need to make a HTTP call out to our server client. HTTP.client. Change anything, and now we need to make a request. So request HTTP.request, new request. So we know we need to make a get, and we know we need the path to be book / and the ISBN. HTTP.get, and we need to /book /s, which will be our ISBN. And where are we? Let's bring things onto new lines to make it a bit more readable. Okay, and that's that one. We're missing one more argument to the function, which is the body to get, so we'll provide no body, and that returns an error. That's perfect. Okay. And now we can do client.do, we'll pass in the request. Now let's run the test and see where we're at. Okay, still failing. What's failing now? Apparently it's missing the request. And that's because we hadn't provided the host. So S here, and that is c.host. And the ISBN. Let's try again, shall we? Okay. So now it says we're making the request as we expect, but we're making an incorrect request. And the bit we've made a mistake on is we're not sending the accept header. Let's add the accept header. Header.add accept should be application /JSON. Let's run that test again to see where we're at. Okay, so our test is now passing, but we've still got this hard-coded error. So let's solve this. Let's build the error properly from the response. So resp, ignore the error for now. We need to get the error body back. So we can use some dot decoder, new decoder. That comes from the response body, and we want it to write it to an error. So decode, and so we go JSON error. Error like so. Pass in error. And now we can rewrite our error. Use p.sprintf. We want a %s. This out. %s. So that needs to move inside here. No, here, and we want to use JSON error dot code, the first argument, and JSON error dot message as the second. Let's see if that's worked. And we've completed this test now. We know that the contract of how we expect a 404 to be handled is implemented. Now we can move on to writing a test for when there is a book. Now I'm just going to copy some of the code. So we'll have this, and then let's minimize that down. Create a new test. On the book client, get book that does exist. So got a Pact again. Need to add the interaction. Given. This time we want our provider to ensure that the book with the ISBN we're going to work with does exist. Given book with ISBN. And we'll go backwards this time. Exists. And this gives our provider the opportunity during its testing phase to create that book. Then we want to use the upon receiving. Get. We can add that. Let's make sure it matches. That'd be nice. Different ISBN this time. Pull this over a bit so we can concentrate on the test code for a little while. With request. Define the request. Request. In fact, I think probably can just do a quick copy paste and an edit job. So we'll copy this, speed things across. So we're going to make the get and use a new ISBN to get it. And we're going to still expect the accept headers. So that's our request setup. The contract hasn't changed at this point, but it will be the response contract that we're interested in. So we'll respond with. That's better. And we'll do a quick copy paste to speed things up again. Edit it. We're expecting it to be found this time, so we need to just change the status from status not found to status OK. And we don't expect an error back now, we actually expect a book back. So let's just go and make sure, yep, this is public, so book. There we go. And now we can provide some examples again for Pact before we move too far. Let's go and concentrate on that. Pact, colon, example equals, just speed life up a bit. Okay, so our example ISBN is 1. Example title is testing all the things. And the image is testing.jpg. The genre is computers. And the year published. So it's an int, so it's 2021. There we are. So there's our examples all set up. And now we need to verify this interaction. So again, s.no error. And that's pact.verify. We need to provide that function again, so we'll call it test still. And to jolly things along, we'll bring this down. Client connection working off the port. need a different ISBN. Now, expect book back. So in this one, we're going to jolly things along a bit. Instead of using the ifs, we'll use the assertion library. So s dot no error, not expect an error back, step 1, and then s dot equal. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fields. So the ISBN should be this. And then we go title and image and genre and year published should be an int. We know that's this year. One, just quickly, is computers. Title set. And there is our test all set up, ready to go. Let's run our test and see what happens. Have a failure. So we're not getting back any of the values we're expecting. So we need to solve that. It looks like our request was made as we expected, so it's now a matter of actually just handling that contracted response. Let's look at the code. Okay. So at the moment we just return error. We don't want to do that. And the book is empty. Let's add some more code. So if there's an error, or if there's a 404, if response status equals http.status 404, not found. Wait, there we go. We can do all of this. Not status, status code. Excellent. Wiggly line's gone away. So now we need to do the decoding of the book. So B book. Thank you. Borrow this line. Passing in the book. And we will return the book and no error. Okay. Run a test and see what happens. And our tests both pass. So we have a test for the contract of a book that doesn't exist and a test for the contract for a book that does exist. Now there's an opportunity now to do a little bit of refactoring on our test side. So we've got a bit of duplication of the creation of the instance of the Pact struct. So we can move that into a setup function. But previously we've used setup test function, and that function will be run before each test is run. But for this case, we don't want that. We only want one instance of the Pact for all of the tests in the suite. And we can use the setup suite function provided by Testify to do that for us. Let's add that. We need a variable, Pact, I believe is a pointer, yeah, pointer to Pact. There we go. And we need to set up our suite. And the function looks very similar to the setup test. So it's func and the receiver is sweet. Use S, and it, instead of setup test, it's set up sweet. So it doesn't take anything, doesn't return anything, and it should have been a pointer. Now we can move the Pact instantiation out of this test and into here like so. We can just delete this one altogether. Now let's just check our test works. Test is still passing. Now there's one thing left to do now, and that's to tell Pact that we're done testing. We're done with this contract for this provider. And so we need to tear down Pact. And the end, again, not after every test, after the end of the suite. So we will use a suite teardown function rather than a test teardown function. So function is the book client S, and it's tear down suite. Doesn't take anything, doesn't return anything. And what we want to do is call pact.teardown. And that tells Pact that we have done with the contract. Now if we run our tests, they all pass. And now we have two interactions for our provider book API from the consumer Mark's book client. We're going to leave the testing here for now. We're just going to test the happy path and the 404 not found path, and we're not going to worry too much about kind of handling the errors in this code because we're looking at Pact. So our implementation is complete, and we've used Pact to verify that we make the correct call and its servers responded, and we can check that we handle the response correctly. But the thing I keep mentioning is that Pact is a contract testing framework, and that's the contract between these two pieces, the client that we're creating today and the server we created in the last few episodes. Now, how can we run these tests against the provider without having to know about all this happening and duplicate these tests manually ourselves in the provider? And the answer is the Pact file. And we told it we were going to put the Pact into the directory Pact. So let's go and have a look there. We have this directory called Pact. We have a file which is Mark's book client book API.json. And that is the Pact file. That is the contract between our client, Mark's book client, and our provider, the book API. So open up that file. We can have a look at it. Terminal. So we can see we've named the consumer, which is our client, and the provider, the book API, and we have some interactions defined here. So we have 1 and 2, as we expect, and we've got a description. So we'll look at one of these. So the description says a GET request for a book with the ISBN of this. And then the provider state is our given. So book with ISBN, blah, exists. And then we've defined our request. So we expect to make a GET call to the path book / and our ISBN with the headers application.json for accept. Thank you for watching this episode of Testing All the Things. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please rate and review the video and subscribe to the channel. If you did not and you have any feedback, please leave a comment in the comment section of the video or contact me on Twitter @Bradle.